Today's episode will be dealing with gender ideology. If you would like more information or resources, you can check out genspect.org, genspect.org, donoharmmedicine.org, advocatesprotectingchildren.org, and partnersforethicalcare.com. I will also link these at the end of the video. Thank you. Hello, and thank you for coming to a new episode of Declassified. My name is Dawn Pierce, and today we have January Littlejohn. If you do not know who she is, well, today you will. She has been speaking all over about her happenings with gender ideology. She's from Tallahassee, Florida, mother of 3 children, and she has an extensive background that I'd like to enter before we get her on here. She has a master's degree in counseling and education specialist degree, also licensed in mental health counselor in the state of Florida. In her free time, she is devoted to educating parents and school officials and mental health professionals on the dangers of gender ideology and trying to restore parental rights in our schools. And I just want to thank you for coming here today and meeting with us. So I hope that was a good enough opening for introduction, because we have a lot to cover. So I just want to thank you.
Absolutely, Dawn. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm just so thankful that you come on. I know you're in the state of Florida and we are in South Carolina, but we are facing some of the same issues in our state right now, and the push for gender ideology. And a lot of parents are thinking, what is the big deal? And I believe that they really need to hear your story. I've been following you for some time and listening to your story, and it is one that just, with your background and your history to be experiencing this yourself, this is just absolutely insane. But before we do get into your story, I just had a couple questions on a medical background. So the diagnosis of in the DSM for gender dysmorphia is the DSM-5 302. Is it 85? I believe I think it's 85. But that is the diagnosis that seems to be going around with a lot of these kids claiming gender dysmorphia. Statistically, how high is that of a diagnosis?
So what you're actually describing is gender dysphoria. There's a different diagnosis called body dysmorphia.
Okay.
And it's interesting because they're both a mental health issue, but one has been normalized and one is treated very differently. So body dysmorphia is where someone becomes obsessed about a certain body part.
Okay.
And so they may fixate on that body part, and that fixation starts to interfere with their everyday life. It could be their nose, it could be their ears, or it's typically something on the face. Okay. And it's very similar to body image issues that you would see in anorexia nervosa, where someone has a delusion idea in their mind and an obsession with a specific part.
Okay.
Now, gender dysphoria historically was gender identity disorder, but in order to quote unquote reduce the stigma, and this was part of the normalization process that the activists were pushing for, it was changed to gender dysphoria, and it was made its own chapter in the DSM.
Oh, wow.
A lot of times in my interviews, because I was trained back in the 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s, I say wrongly DSM-4 because that's so ingrained in my brain. But we're actually on DSM-5. So if I say 4, I mean 5.
Okay.
But so gender dysphoria has now been weaponized by the activists and really utilized for insurance purposes only in order to get coverage for these radical interventions that we will discuss and the surgeries. But the activists have stated very confusedly that, well, a transgender person may or may not have gender dysphoria.
Okay.
Which makes no sense, because if you're not experiencing distress over your body, why would you then need to make changes, irreversible changes, mind you, especially to children's bodies?
Exactly. And so getting to your story, I know a lot of things happened during COVID time, which was a nightmare for every parent and every person and dealt with it differently. So what happened at the time with was she 13 years old at the time, your daughter?
She was, yes. So in the spring of 2020, and this was the height of COVID, our daughter became very withdrawn and anxious, like many kids did.
Right.
And she came to my husband and I and said that she was confused over her sex, that she no longer felt like a girl. She had no previous signs of gender dysphoria, gender confusion, no sex confusion whatsoever. And this was shortly after three of her in-person friends at her local middle school had also started suddenly identifying as transgender.
Oh, wow.
So as a clinician, this did not correlate at all with what I knew to be true about true gender dysphoria.
Right.
Statistically, what this was impossible because it used to be very rare. And if one did have gender dysphoria, it started in early childhood. It did not start in adolescence. And it was mostly males who experienced true gender dysphoria.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so now we're seeing the opposite. Not only are we seeing an explosion in adolescent onset dysphoria, but it's predominantly girls. And it's predominantly girls, up to 40% of which are on the autism spectrum.
Really?
Yes.
That's a huge.
Yes. And so these girls that are falling vulnerable to this gender ideology, which teaches children that sex is a spectrum, which is completely inaccurate biological information. It teaches children they choose their gender identity, that it's completely separate from their biological sex, and that you can be male, female, both, or neither. And the neither was the non-binary that my daughter had initially started gravitating toward. That eventually morphed into other identities for her, like it does for these kids, because the bottom line, Dawn, is they're confused.
Right.
And many of these kids, they actually don't start with the gender identity. They start as bisexual, or they'll identify as pansexual. And then it just continues to morph into this transgender identity. That tends to be kind of the pathway. The sexual orientation becomes a gateway into the gender issues.
Was there like signs leading up to this, or was this just like totally out of the blue?
No, there were definite signs. And, looking back, of course, hindsight is 2020. And I just didn't know. Well, first of all, I didn't even know what gender ideology was. I had no idea that these other identities were taking root in our school system and our culture at large. Gender ideology has really infiltrated every aspect of our culture, including our schools. And so the friend group that she was with initially, and what led her into this, I was initially very happy that she had found a friend group. My daughter has diagnosed ADHD, so making and maintaining friends for her was difficult, like many
and a
of
lot
those
of
children.
kids. Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. And so initially I was excited for her, that I thought she found other quirky, unique children that were a good match for her. And then it started to change around 7th grade. The flags started coming home in terms of she was drawing pride flags for every child. My daughter's a very gifted artist. So she would draw her friends with these flower crowns in the colors of whatever they identified as.
Oh, wow.
And it was almost like the friend group being straight or identifying with your biological sex wasn't cool, because first of all, there's no flag for that. Like, what colors do you have for that? There aren't any. And so there was this push of, well, how do you identify? I'll draw you a picture, or I'll make you a bracelet. So it was like their entire identities were wrapped up into whatever sexual orientation or gender they were claiming to be that week. And it would change all the time, by the way. So I started to get concerned about that. And then, the other thing that I will say, and a lot of parents have experienced this, many of these children who were proclaiming sexual orientations had zero sexual experience,
Most
which
do. Yeah.
we don't want them to have sexual
Right.
experience.
Right.
But I'm even talking about holding hands,
Right.
never been kissed, never had any kind of romantic experience where they even had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So,
Hmm.
they're claiming these orientations
Right.
without
Without
really any.
experience.
Right. And I don't even think they fully understand oftentimes what they're claiming to be.
Right. And we were seeing that here. I mean, the same thing around the same time. My daughter is only 11, and she was saying, kids at school are asking her what her pronouns are or how she identifies and telling them that they're pansexual. And I'm like, some of these words, I'm just like, I have no idea what you're even talking about. And why is this even being discussed? And so for her, she is a sixth grader. So that was like fourth grade starting to hear some of this stuff. And I'm like, you know, it's crazy. So, the pandemic kind of everybody shuts down. So now you head back to school. Well, before you head back to school, was there a change in, say, so was she more withdrawn? Her clothing changed? Like, was she typically girly girly or was she tomboyish?
I mean, it was a mix. She
Mhm.
definitely preferred all my children are very interested in science. She did Sci Girls, which is a very prestigious camp here that you have to apply to at the Mag Lab at Florida
Mhm.
State. So she was always very comfortable identifying a girl as a girl. And of course, that was a source of pride when she would get
Right.
accepted into these Sci Girl camps.
Hmm.
So a lot of her clothing was already pretty gender neutral because they were NASA shirts and
Right. Right.
shirts with wolves on them and just things like that. We
Yeah.
allowed her to dress how she wanted to express herself. That was never an issue for us. So after those red flags, that's when COVID hit.
Hmm.
And I think many of us parents made the mistake of allowing more screen time
Yes.
than we would have normally allowed,
Hmm.
because I did restrict my kids' screen time. My daughter at the time, we had the monitoring on her phone, Bark. We had no social media on her phone. So I guess my point in telling you this is those things will expedite these identities
Right.
because it's so prevalent in
Hmm.
TikTok and Tumblr
Yes.
and Reddit and these other social media avenues. YouTube, there's a lot of trans influencers
Mhm.
on YouTube and TikTok, but my daughter was still exposed. And so for kids that are vulnerable to this ideology, it can come in a lot of different formats. And for her, it was in-person friend groups teaching her this. And then when school started, we were one of the lucky states where had the choice of going back in person.
Right.
Now, it was very restrictive. You had to wear a mask. Parents were not allowed on campus. And so prior to school starting, I reached out to the teacher, as I have done a number of times when my children were experiencing issues, because I saw the school as a partner.
Right. You said
I
you did
had
a
no
lot of
reason.
stuff for them too,
Yeah,
correct?
I mean,
Yeah.
I had no reason not to trust that the school had my child's best interest at heart, just like I did. There was
Hmm.
no reason for me not to believe that, because in the past, I had been included in every 504 meeting. Like you said, I volunteered a lot. I was even
Right.
volunteer of the year at this middle school. So I knew many of the teachers, they knew who I was. I enjoyed being a stay-at-home mom, the PTO mom.
Right. Right.
That was my life. And so I did reach out to a teacher prior to the start of the school year. And I told her that my daughter was experiencing confusion, that my husband and I were struggling to understand what was going on. I mean, I was very honest in this communication via
Right.
email. And I was also very distraught. I was very distraught at this time. I was concerned about my daughter because
Yeah.
at the same time that I started to understand maybe what was going on with my daughter, I started looking down the dark path of what gender affirming care means. So
Right.
just know that that was kind of happening at the same time, and I was getting more and more concerned. So I told the teacher we weren't affirming at home, but at the time I didn't feel like I could stop her from going by a nickname. That's
Okay.
how I thought it would be treated.
Right.
I knew nothing about support plans or these LGBTQ guides that were in place. I knew nothing about that.
Right.
So weeks later, I said, my daughter got in the car and she told me, Mom, I had a meeting today at school and they asked me which restroom I wanted to use. Well, at the time she was identifying as non-binary. So I'm thinking, why was that even relevant? I don't
Right.
understand. Like, I thought you were just going to ask for a nickname.
Right.
Now, hindsight, again, is 2020.
Right.
Now that I know everything that I know, there's no way I would have even let her go that far.
Exactly.
And I can, at the end of our conversation, I'm happy to talk about steps that I think parents should take the minute
Please.
you
Yes.
see this. But with our situation, I was alarmed. I asked her, who was at this meeting? She couldn't even tell me who was at she was like, there were several people at the meeting. She's 13, but
Right. She
emotionally,
should not been there.
she was only 11
Right.
because of her ADHD. So I immediately emailed the guidance counselor because, again, I wasn't allowed on campus. Otherwise, I would have been in the office right then and
Right.
there. And I was called back with both the guidance counselor and the assistant principal. And I was told they could not give me any information about what occurred at the meeting because my 13-year-old daughter was now protected by a non-discrimination law.
Wow.
They wouldn't give me the law because I asked for the law. They didn't know the law. They just said, we just can't give you any information. The only recourse you have is to go to the assistant superintendent who was, overseeing this policy and equity and all of those types
Right.
of things, the Title IX coordinator. And so I did that. And to give you a timeline of how long this took, my daughter had the meeting at the beginning of September. I did not get a meeting with the principal until the end of October.
Oh my goodness.
So this is many weeks that have gone by. And my husband and I finally got a meeting. It was right before the second 9 weeks was started.
Mm-hmm.
And we were shown the transgender, gender nonconforming support plan that they completed with our daughter. It was a 6-page document where a
Wow.
guidance counselor, the assistant principal, and a social worker I had never met were in a private room with my daughter. And they asked her not only what name and pronoun she wanted to use, but which restroom and locker room she preferred to use, and which sex she preferred to room with on overnight field trips.
This is just crazy.
They also asked her, how should we refer to you when speaking to your parents? And that's a really critical question on these guides because my husband and I knew what was happening with our child. There are many parents
they have
who
no clue.
don't know their child is confused over their sex and they are kept in the dark about these support plans.
They were helping them lie, basically.
That's correct. They were colluding with minor children to keep this, what it is, Dawn, this process of these gender support plans is called a social transition. And so it's really a psychosocial medical intervention that schools are doing behind the backs of parents, and they are grossly unqualified to be doing this.
Right. And for people who don't know, the 504 plans, my daughter has one. I've sat in on the meetings and they usually have some sort of school psychologist, the teachers in there and vice principal or somebody in there, and they sit around and they make a plan with the parent involved of what the accommodations would be for a child that has some sort of medical, like my daughter's is anxiety. So some sort of plan to help them learn better. So when this 504, this is what is unbelievable. When you leave the 504, you get a plan. It's printed out, everybody signs it and given to the parent. So the parents know what was discussed and it's supposed to be honored and it stays in the child's file and follows the child through education. So knowing that that's what that's supposed to be, none of this was done for you at all. Everything was locked down, kept private until the next 9 weeks. So you went all this time not even knowing. I mean, did you ask your daughter, well, what was said, what happened? I mean, how much information did you get from your daughter regarding it?
Well, you have to understand that when the schools are interfering the way that they did,
Hmm.
it creates a huge wedge between the
Right.
parent-child relationship.
Agreed.
And so at the time, we had solicited the help of a mental health counselor.
Hmm.
And so I was, of course, communicating with her, letting her know what was happening. And I had to tread lightly with my daughter. Her mental health was spiraling.
Right.
She was not in a good place. And so while we were trying to figure out what was going on with what the school had done and this plan, I was not pushing too hard to get information from her
Right.
because I knew that it would push her further away from us. And that is the
Right.
opposite of what
Of
I
what you
wanted
want
to
to do.
do.
Absolutely.
After we were shown the plan, we actually tried to pull her from school right then. We tried 2 different schools, went through the entire, and if you've ever applied to a private school, some of these application procedures are pretty lengthy.
Yeah.
We went through the application process, we went through the interview process, paid the fees, and we were turned away by both schools.
Why? Because did they talk to the other school? I mean, was it kind of like they just wouldn't accept that, or were they afraid of issues?
I don't know, with private schools, they have their own rules and regulations when it comes
Okay.
to admissions. One of the schools only went to 8th grade, and she was in the 8th grade at the time. So
Oh,
that made
okay.
sense to me.
Right.
Because if she really needed a smaller learning environment, which is what we were trying to do, because
Okay.
in the beginning of the school year, they were doing this, like it was both online and in person.
Right.
And God bless the teachers for trying to figure all this out. But in the beginning, it was a hot mess.
Yeah.
They were struggling to learn. People like my daughter who have ADHD trying to
Right.
learn an entire system. And
That's what we went through.
most of the work was done via online and trying to learn this new system of way they were doing things. I mean, it was a nightmare for her. So in addition to the sex confusion, she was struggling, and she was a straight A student. She was struggling with this new format.
Right. The whole
So my husband,
education.
exactly. So we were turned away from those 2 private schools. We weren't left with many options at that point, so we did let her finish out that school year.
Mm.
And in hindsight, you look back, should we have pulled her and homeschooled her? I don't know. Maybe.
Right.
I don't have an answer to that. We were doing the best we could, and we were working alongside her mental health counselor. And really, I
Right.
was concerned about her mental health deteriorating even further if she was back
Right.
home, because that was such a difficult time
Mm.
when the school shut down for her. So I didn't want to isolate her, but intuitively, I knew we needed to get her away from these influences
Right.
at the middle school.
So you talked a little bit about you didn't affirm at home and not affirming. What was it that you allowed? What did you do to, I mean, you wanted to keep the peace. So what was your solution with your daughter and your husband and family to not affirm, but to not make this situation worse than it was?
Sure. And that's a great question. So we affirmed her pain because she really was struggling, but
Mhm.
we did not affirm the false identity.
Right.
And so we read a lot up on this issue. I did a deep dive into what this is. I wanted to know, why are these girls suddenly rejecting their natal bodies? What
Right.
is appealing? What is seducing them into this false belief system that you can even change your sex? I mean,
Mm.
these kids are being lied to at every turn when it comes to
Right.
this ideology. Number one, you cannot change your sex,
Correct.
no matter what puberty blockers, testosterone, surgical procedures. You're only changing your outward appearance.
Correct. The
You are
DNA is
not
still the
able,
same.
that is 100% correct. And some of, they use these euphemisms to describe these radical medical interventions. Like they'll, instead of double mastectomy, they say top surgery.
Right.
It's a way to have these children really disassociate from their own bodies.
Mm.
And so when you get a child, you destabilize their identity and you get them to disassociate from their bodies, then it's not a big deal to think about chopping your breasts off at 14.
Right.
And
Right.
that is happening. That is happening all over this country, even though they claimed it wasn't. And thank the Lord for investigative journalists who did not
Yes.
stop. And even Reuters has now published statistics from an insurance company on how many mastectomies, double mastectomies were done on minors. So they can no longer say this isn't happening. Boston Children's Hospital, basically any hospital that has a pediatric gender clinic, you can almost bet they were performing surgeries in the form of double mastectomies on minors.
And here in South Carolina, there was a bill passed in December, and MUSC, which is in Charleston, their gender clinic was shut down. The lies that are told to the parents, as a parent, and actually I know about 2 kids that are transitioning. The lies, number one, to the parents is that you can go back. Even with these hormones, there's no, long-term effects. That's one. But 2 is that if you don't affirm your child or you don't let this happen, that the suicide is going to happen. And I just see so many articles now of people that did go through it that were affirmed. And the parents, I don't hear from the parents of, I don't know how I would feel as if I let my child go through that and then looking at their body later and saying, what was I thinking? Because that is another form of abuse. Social media, like you're saying, everything you look at, the woman is being devaluized. These children are looking at their body saying they don't like it. First, a lot of these girls don't like their body. They don't like the changes that they have coming. But it just seems like all their problems are going to go away, by changing the outside instead of dealing with the mentality.
Right. And that's what they're being told, Dawn. And unfortunately, back when I was going through puberty, I don't know one girl that was comfortable in her body at some point in time during puberty. That is just something that's a rite of passage that we all went through and got through together. But instead of these girls being told it's normal to feel uncomfortable in your body during this time, they're told if you feel any discomfort at all, it's because you're trans. They're indoctrinating these girls to falsely believe that discomfort means something's wrong with you. And that is just not true. So they've pathologized normal puberty angst that we all went through. And so you have a few things happening at the same time. I don't even believe that a lot of these girls have true gender dysphoria. I believe they have convinced themselves that they do 100%. But what you also have to understand is that most, if not all of these girls have co-occurring mental health issues.
Right.
They either have previous sexual or physical trauma. They have anxiety. They have eating disorders, history of self-harm. Some are on the autism spectrum, like I had said, ADHD, depression. So we're not talking about emotionally healthy people to start. These children already have vulnerabilities that make them gravitate on to this solution. It's like they've created the issue of purposefully confusing the child, and then they've created the solution. But the reason why what the schools are doing is so important is because social transition is the first step toward medical transition.
Right.
And this is what makes them complicit, because most of these school districts have an affirmation only model, which means regardless of how old the child is, regardless of how long they have felt this way, regardless of other co-occurring mental health issues, you are only to affirm whatever self-identification transgender identity the child brings to you.
Wow.
That is incredibly harmful for multiple reasons.
Yes.
Number one, it means that the child's co-occurring issues may be pushed aside and not explored and resolved.
Right.
Number two, we now know that if you socially transition a child, they are less likely to go back to identifying as their biological sex.
Right.
And isn't that what we would want? You know, when you look
Yes.
at the history of gender dysphoria, like true gender dysphoria, the research showed the majority of those children, if not allowed to socially or medically transition, would desist, meaning their dysphoria, their discomfort would resolve by
Mhm.
18 or 19 years old. Now
And
we're fast tracking any child who feels any discomfort. So you're only providing parents with one treatment option, which
right.
is social transition, which leads to medical transition. And that is, first of all, that's completely unethical. To
It
not
is.
give parents other treatment options, especially that are less radical,
Right.
and you know, they're lying when they say puberty blockers are irreversible. That's a lie. Number one, because when you give a child puberty blockers, not only are you stopping puberty, you're stopping brain and bone development.
Correct.
The truth is, we don't fully understand the long-term consequences of what putting children on these puberty blockers would do. We've never stopped puberty in a child before.
Right.
Puberty blockers had a very specific purpose, and that was only to pause precocious puberty, which means puberty that happens really, really, really early, like in
Right.
toddlerhood or, 7 or 8. We're talking when it's really too early. We
Mhm.
want to pause that for just a few, couple of years or even a year, and then let it proceed naturally. There are all kinds of things that happen during puberty that we don't fully understand, especially when it comes to brain development.
Correct.
So the other thing that you will see is once a child is put on puberty blockers, 98% of those children will go on to cross-sex hormones. That is
Oh,
not a pause button.
no, that
That
is
is a
huge.
bullet train toward being a medical patient for life.
For life. For life.
Once you
Absolutely.
go on testosterone as a biological female or estrogen as a biological male, you can't ever stop taking that medication. And those medications produce all kinds of medical negative consequences. We're talking in females, vaginal atrophy and
Mm.
uterine atrophy to the point where these girls have to get a medically necessary hysterectomy.
Right.
It puts them in premature menopause. Think about that. A teenager experiencing menopause.
Yeah.
Some of the girls experience hair loss, like a male, like
Right.
receding
The male pattern
hairline.
baldness. Yeah.
Correct. They also put them at higher risk of cardiovascular disease.
Mm.
So we're talking really serious medical side effects, all in the name of a feeling
Right.
in their mind. And we're doing this to children
Right.
who
And the
do
school.
not have the cognitive maturity to understand the long-term consequences of this. They don't even have the ability to process, how am I going to feel about not being able to have children? Because these
Right.
drugs do sterilize these children. They don't have the ability. What 12-year-old knows if she wants to have a child one day?
Right. Right.
Not many. And further, they don't have the ability to even think, how am I going to feel about not having my breast in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And this is why we are seeing so many detransitioners
Mhm.
around 5 to 7 years after they have started down this medical pathway, because it's when their brains are finally fully developed and they're
Right.
saying, this did not fix my pain.
Right.
Further, I may have passed as a male, but I look in the mirror and I know it's a lie.
Right.
This did not resolve my dysphoria. It did not fix the trauma that I was trying to run from. Many of these girls, including my daughter, had an intense fear of being sexualized. That is a major problem in
Right.
our society. So if a girl, for instance, is exposed to porn, as many of them have now said, many of the transitioners have said they were either sexually assaulted, exposed to porn, or they had unwanted sexual advances.
Right.
If they were given an option to opt out of that
It
as
would
a
have made a
child,
difference.
but it's not really an option, but it's being imposed. You can just become a
Right.
boy, then that won't happen. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to
Right.
be, you don't have to worry about being assaulted again or being sexualized in the way that you saw in the violent porn.
Mm.
So we're talking about a lot of different things happening at the same time in
Right.
a very short amount of time
Yeah.
to get us to where we are right now.
Right.
And this is
And
being infused not just in the schools, Dawn, it's in their media.
oh
The
yeah.
mainstream media has hidden the truth about what gender affirming care really is. They didn't report on things that were happening. It's just now starting to change a little bit, but even things that come out in the New York Times are incredibly biased, incredibly
Right.
biased. And so, unfortunately, it has become a politicized issue because the only media that was willing to report the truth on this was more right leaning. And the only politicians that were willing to stand up and do something about it were the Republicans.
Right.
But I can tell you very clearly, this is not a political issue for the families experiencing this hell nightmare. And most
Exactly.
of the parents I speak with and I help are more liberal Democratic families, and they feel completely abandoned by
Absolutely.
their political party.
Mm. And like you were just saying, I tried to find out facts and information as far as detransitioning, and it's very hard to find anything. There's nothing listed. Instead, they want to throw other facts of where money is coming from to help these kids, and nothing is really posted on what happens from here. But I did see something on one of your articles, and I found it very interesting, and I think that parents need to hear is there was a certain word, I can't remember it offhand, that they said when you do not affirm your child, there was another word they came up with saying basically that you're abusing your child for not affirming them. What was the word that they used? I'm trying to remember. There was one of your articles I was just reading that they're just saying basically, you don't affirm your child, you're abusing them. And so a lot of these parents are afraid to say that, as a parent, you stand behind your child no matter what, you try to do the best you can by them. You don't want to harm them. But parents, I feel like, are being bullied into doing this.
100%. Many of them are coerced, like I was saying before, and bullied into medically transitioning their child because we look to doctors to be the experts, right? We trust doctors to tell us things that are going to help us or our children. And this one area of medicine has become ideological over what's best for the child's welfare. And that is the unfortunate truth. And it's driven by big pharma. It's driven by the money that's being made off these children. Because once you become a patient, you are a patient for life. That is worth a heck of a lot of money.
Absolutely.
But the one word I hear over and over, and I don't know if this is where you were going with this, we're deemed unsupportive parents for not affirming. That's the term you hear over and over, even in the gender support plan. Are your parents supportive? Well, who gets to determine what the word supportive means? That's a very subjective word. And our job as parents isn't to support everything our child ever wants, especially if it's going to lead to harm.
It's to parent.
You're telling me that if I want to protect my child from medical harm, that I'm now unsupportive and abusive to my child?
Right.
And I know there was a lawmaker in Virginia actually trying to get that passed. And that is completely absurd. That is so dangerous to want to take children from their parents for not affirming a lie. And that has happened, by the way. Children have been removed from their parents for not affirming. And one of the most, there's been two horrific cases. One of the reasons why my husband and I went public with our story, and we did end up filing a federal lawsuit about a year after the violation happened. And we did not do that lightly. If I wanted to file a lawsuit, I would have done that right away. I wouldn't have
Right,
taken over a year to try to
right.
resolve this issue with the district.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened is there was a girl in Clay County, same thing. School counselor was meeting with that child for months, 12 years old. She tried to commit suicide in the bathroom twice before her parents were brought into the
Oh
situation.
my goodness.
So we're talking about severe consequences for schools doing these medical social transitionings behind the back of parents. The other girl, Sage, now there's a law in her name, and I pray that it passes in Virginia, but you can look it up. It's called Sage's Law.
Okay.
And this little girl, again, socially transitioned behind her parents' back, and these were her grandparents that were raising her. Grandma had no idea that she was leading a double life at school. She was sexually assaulted in the boys' bathroom.
Oh my goodness.
Came home. The school finally called grandma, didn't tell them that she was going by a different name, but said, your granddaughter's upset. You need to come get her. She finally confided in grandma what was happening and that she had been assaulted in the bathroom. Grandma said, it's, okay, we're going to deal with this. You stay home from school tomorrow. She had been online talking to a sexual predator and ran away that night thinking she was meeting a boy her age, and she was sex trafficked twice.
Oh my gosh.
The state would not give her back to her grandmother because she would not affirm the male identity.
Wow.
So look up that story. It is horrific what this child went through in the name of a false identity that was pushed on her.
Right. And I don't think parents see the bigger dangers. I mean, some parents I see saying, oh, this is my kid and this is, but the school is taking a bigger step in promoting, in just, I've seen the gender unicorn has now showed up here in South Carolina. Just some of the things they have now, all these advisory clubs and things that are not parent run or run, just all these things that these kids need to take as part of their curriculum. And in certain districts, it's actually has just grown and they feel that it's necessary. These counselors are coming into the classrooms and teaching different things weekly to the kids. So they're not even coming to them sometimes. They're sorting them out into the classroom and tell them it's okay for this and everything going on with that. So with all this going on, I mean, the kids are already confused with everything. And the parents, I mean, I was the type, okay, drop my son off and there you go to school, and just think that they were learning what they needed to be learned. And how much times have changed is absolutely ridiculous. And to hear your story, and there's so many others like it coming forward now. Like one of the people I've been following is Chloe Cole. Yes. And to hear her, she is an amazing warrior. If anybody has not heard of her, they need to look up her story. And she speaks out that you are not born in the wrong body. And that was what was fed to her basically. And as a parent, we want the best for our children, but social media does a bang up job, along with the friends and everything else, of telling our kids that they're something wrong, that they have to have a certain format. And one of the things I've just learned about too is with schools. I don't know if this is in Florida or not, but there's something called in loco parentis. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that just a legal term stating that when you drop your child at school, that they serve as the authoritarian figure for your child because you're not present?
Right. But how far is that going? I mean, it seems like it's going a lot further than just protecting our children while they're there on the premises. So
yeah, so here's the problem. Let me tell you a little bit about what's happened with my lawsuit, but then tell you also what steps Florida has taken to strengthen parental rights. So we filed a federal lawsuit based on parental rights violations.
Okay.
The district argued not that the facts of the case were wrong. They said, yes, the school district did that. Yes, they withheld the information. but it doesn't meet the threshold of shocking the conscience. In other words, yes, we did this, but it's really not that bad. And the judge
Wow.
agreed. So
The
what
judge agreed?
That's correct. My lawsuit was dismissed this past December. Now we are appealing the decision, but there is no guarantee that the appellate court will overturn that ruling. We are hopeful because this ruling completely stands in the face of the Supreme Court ruling, which is our constitutional protected right to direct the upbringing of our children, which includes mental and medical care, right? So we'll have to see how that plays out in the court. But what parents need to understand, especially based on this ruling, and another ruling had come out of Massachusetts, almost the exact ruling on a similar case. Parents need to be asking themselves, if socially transitioning a child does not meet the threshold for a parent to be able to hold a school district accountable, what else can schools then do with our minor children that also wouldn't meet that same threshold? My trust in public schools is broken. And they are not doing anything to gain it back. They are doubling down on this non-scientific ideology that is very harmful to children. So let me be clear. I think every state needs a parent bill of rights to strengthen. We shouldn't need one, Dawn. We shouldn't need it
right now. We have
we
several
really
bill of
shouldn't,
rights.
but we do. So you need a parent bill of rights in every state. And then the bill that I testified heavily for last year, which got all kinds of negative media attention by design, was the parental rights and education bill. That was the one that was labeled "Don't Say Gay" by Equality Florida here in Florida. But that was by design. It had nothing to do with saying the word gay. It had to do with ensuring that parents were included in critical decisions occurring with their children. Now, let me tell you, that has at least legally stopped them from doing gender support plans with children, but there are children still being unofficially affirmed at school. So how many laws do we need to respect parental authority when it comes to this issue? So now the Heritage Foundation has come up with model legislation called the Given Name Act. And that legislation states that schools can only call children by their biological name and use pronouns that correspond to their biological sex unless the parent gives express written permission. But that should be completely unnecessary. Our children belong to us. They do not belong to the schools. And for the schools to cross this line and think they know better than us, when most of them don't even know the statistics about social transitioning, they don't know that teenagers are getting double mastectomies in the name of gender identity. But even if they did, would they care? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but many of them wholeheartedly believe to not affirm a child is abuse. And they buy into this unscientific notion that they're born this way. No child is born in the wrong body. There is no such thing as a transgender child. There are children that are experiencing confusion and distress over their sex. And it's our job as parents to protect them and walk them through that confusion, whether it be on your own or with a mental health professional that will not only affirm, because many mental health professionals will. And what's really frightening is that in some states, therapists feel like they can't even help a child become comfortable in their natal sex because it's considered conversion therapy. Traditional talk therapy should never be considered conversion therapy. Now, in Florida, there were 2 therapists that sued the city of Boca Raton based on this law, and they won. So it's, you know, it's a battle. It's a battle for our children's minds. It is a battle over language. And parents need to start standing up and understanding this is not innocent. Because even this,
Absolutely.
even if it is a phase, Dawn, Google non-binary surgeries. I've heard so many parents think, oh, well, so what if they just want to be androgynous? This is not a
No.
neutral, just clothing
Right.
experimentation.
Right.
We're talking drastic surgeries. We're talking microdosing with testosterone to achieve an in-between state, whatever that means.
Horrible.
This is completely unethical, and we are seeing experimentation on children's bodies in real time, and there is going to be devastating consequences. Now, you brought up suicide.
Yeah.
Suicide has absolutely been weaponized against parents. And any good clinician that knows anything about suicidality knows that this is a complete false narrative being pushed, because someone that has suicidal ideation or even complete suicide, God forbid, it is
Yeah.
never just about one thing. So to oversimplify this into if you don't affirm a child will commit suicide is complete nonsense.
Right.
Even WPATH doctors. So WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the group that created these guidelines that were then blindly adopted by American Academy of Pediatrics, American Medical Association, American School Counselor Association. And even though they're mere guidelines, they are adopted as if they are standards of care that went through rigorous testing.
Right.
That never happened.
Mm.
But even doctors within WPATH, like Dr. Erica Anderson, Dr. Marcy Bowers, Dr. Laura Edwards Leeper, they are saying, first of all, that is not true that a child will commit suicide if they're not immediately affirmed in transgender identity. There's no evidence of that. Also, there is no consensus on the best way to treat children with gender distress.
Right.
So they acknowledge that, but for some reason, the American Academy of Pediatrics and all these other professional medical associations don't seem to acknowledge even what WPATH is saying. And so you're seeing a complete side of medicine being hijacked by activism over
Right.
actual ethical medical care. And it's truly frightening. And I pray that the tide turns sooner rather than later, because we are seeing real harm, like what Chloe Cole is saying.
Right.
Her breasts were removed as a teenager, and now she will have to live with that for the rest of her young life. She is only 18 years old, and she has no idea if she can have children.
She was talking about the pain that she goes through and stuff that would be common in a woman maybe in her 50s. I mean,
That's right.
18 years old in their 50s. So for parents that are dealing with the situation, how do you know you're going to a doctor for your kids, a pediatrician, to discuss these issues? How do you know that you're safe, like that they're not going to give you, I mean, a lot of people hold doctors in such a high standard of that they're going to do the best when it comes to not just this, but vaccinations and in all around healthcare for their child. With the whole pandemic, some people are waking up to, hey, I'm not doing this, or, coming back to that, I'm the parent, I should be doing this. But for so long, it seems like we sat back and thought, okay, the schools and the doctors and the psychologists have our children best in mind, because it's not, and I've had this said plenty of times by other parents, that's not my profession. That's not, I have to depend on them. As a parent, I think I know what's best of my child because I know my child. That's it. You can't tell me otherwise. And what might be great for me might not be great for your child. But as a parent, what is a danger? Like, what would be, say, like a big red flag for a parent bringing their kid to a doctor to discuss some of these issues?
So a safe space sticker
Yeah.
in the office, that would be a red flag. Any kind of propaganda would be a red flag.
Right.
If your doctor asks you to leave the room, that is a red flag. Don't ever leave the room with your child with a pediatrician. And I hate that I even have to say that.
Right.
But we have a pediatrician here in Tallahassee who is, by the way, a professor at our med school at Florida State, who on film stated, until the child reaches puberty, their bodies are a blank slate.
No way.
Think about that.
Wow.
So this is the kind of activist doctors that med schools are pushing out. Go look at the statement about transgender students from the American School Counselor Association.
Mm.
This is being pushed from the CDC, from our federal government, from the teachers union. The teachers union are not your friend. And
Right.
any teachers that are concerned about this issue, go look at your union statement on this. Stop paying dues to them. This is where your money is going. There are things that people can do, even if they're uncomfortable speaking out.
Right.
So another red flag, you know, when my daughter was in the thick of all this, because she has resolved her distress and she is on a path to being healthy.
That's
I don't
wonderful.
talk much about my daughter because
Right.
I am fiercely protective over her privacy now. And
Right.
if she ever wants to tell her story, that is hers to tell.
Right. And she
But-
will be a powerful person to be speaking if that's what she chooses later on. That would be great.
I mean, that's, you know, I'm never going to put that on someone because
Right.
speaking out in this arena is not easy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I had to vet every single person my daughter came in contact with.
Mm.
So you have to do the groundwork. You can no longer assume because a doctor holds an MD that they share your values.
Right.
And so you have to do an interview. I had to interview multiple therapists before I found the right one for my child that would explore underlying issues that were related to the gender distress, but not solely focus on the gender distress.
Right.
So it is possible to get children out of this, Dawn, but what I would say to parents that think that this is irrelevant to them, or they don't really need to worry about them, or what's the big deal? If you wait until this trans train comes into your house, it is too late.
Right.
It takes a very long, hellish road to deprogram your child. And you will know very quickly with just a few questions with your own
Right.
children if they have been indoctrinated into this. Ask them, how many genders are there? Are you hearing anything about gender at school?
Right.
What
And I
are they
feel that's like
teaching-
all we hear.
Yeah, what are they teaching you about sex? Are they teaching you that it's binary or non-binary? Have you heard about this non-binary identity? What does that mean? I'm hearing that word.
Mm.
Like, be inquisitive, be curious,
Right.
and see what your children know. Because even if they themselves aren't vulnerable to thinking they are transgender, it's almost like they are being bullied into being an ally of some
Right.
sort. And so,
Absolutely.
and they require complete all or nothing support.
Mm.
You can't question it. You can't
Right.
believe
Can't be in
something
between.
different. Otherwise, you are a homophobic, transphobic bigot.
Right.
And that is just not true. And that silencing worked for a very long time. But there's enough of us now where you can't gaslight us all. You can't gaslight us all. We're
Right.
not going away. Children's welfare is too important. And I will not stop until this is done.
And I thank you for, being so candid about this, because this is something, like I said, it's not just a Florida problem. It's not just a South Carolina problem. This is all over. I am originally from Massachusetts. I've been here 15 years. And, what brought us basically here was the award-winning schools and for public schools. And that's not the case anymore. I mean, through the years, we've seen the deterioration going on, but it seems these past few years has been all about the gender ideology down to the curriculum, the books.
Yes. The
books that are
SEL.
getting it.
the
Yes, the
sex
SEL, the
ed.
CRT. Yes,
It's
everything
all
that's
a
been in
vehicle. The GSA clubs, Dawn. If your school has a GSA club, find out what's being taught in it. Is your child a member? See if they'll
Right.
even give you that information.
And I was told there was nothing they could do as far as about the advisory clubs, that they had to have all these different advisory clubs, and they were meeting like every other Wednesday a month or something like that. And it was just like, if your kid was into games, your kid be into games. If they wanted to be into LGBTQ now, which I have a problem with that right there, but also having these groups, because it's not parent approved. So it's not like they're saying, my daughter told me, hey, these are the groups, this is what I could sign up for. But not a lot of parents know that. And these laptops that they give the children, have tons. If I keep saying this, every show that I've done, I keep saying, as a parent, go through your child's laptop. You will not believe what you find, especially if you start looking under the advanced English and the social work page.
Yeah.
They have all these questionnaires. They wanted my daughter to take something about, do a quiz on a culture club. And it had to be like, how do you identify? Do you want to stand up and talk? What's your pronouns? And I'm just like sitting there like, what is this? I mean, this is not, when is the education coming in? It seems like it's all taken up by all this other stuff, that there's no learning going on at all. And the books, and parents are stepping up in the gap finally, more, seeing all this going on. So back to what I was saying about the LGBTQ, help me understand something. It seems to keep growing. So to me, lesbian, bi, gay is a feeling. How do we mix feelings with all of a sudden being in the wrong body? I mean, I don't know how we get transgender from there. I mean,
yeah. So historically, what happened is so much emphasis and activism was put on trying to legalize gay marriage and get people that were gay to have the same rights as people that were heterosexual.
Okay.
Okay. Around 2015, when gay marriage was legalized at the Supreme Court level, all of that activism that had been focused on the LGB suddenly went to the T.
Mm.
And this messaging of we're born this way, because the LGB attached to the T went over to the T, when they're very different. Sexual orientation has nothing to do with gender identity.
Right.
And most people, this whole notion of gender identity is not even a scientific notion.
Right.
There's no internal sense of gender. Now, have we changed how expression occurs? Is that a spectrum? Of course. We've had people like Prince, Mick Jagger, the Eurythmics lady. There have been historical people who did not fit gender norms.
Right.
We have tomboys.
Right. And who's to say what's not normal?
Right. Especially when it comes to clothing and hairstyles. That does not change your sex.
Right.
And so a lot of this transgender ideology is very archaic, and then it's built in on rigid gender stereotypes. So if you're a tomboy and you like dressing like a boy and you're more drawn toward masculine things, oh, it's because you're trans, you're really a boy. It is complete and utter nonsense.
Right.
And honestly, it's a disgrace to what the feminists worked for so hard all those years ago, which is to eradicate gender roles.
Right.
So it's really unbelievable to me as a woman to see this happening to predominantly girls, why it's mostly defended by women.
Right.
It's like we're tearing each other down. It's unreal what's happening. But when it comes to children, they should be off limits.
Right. Leave them alone.
100%. Now, personally, I believe there should be safeguarding like there used to be, even for adults.
Right.
But I don't know how to put that genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
I really don't, because now you've got such easy access. Planned Parenthood is one of the biggest dispensers of testosterone. Right. They are treating it as if it is birth control pills.
Correct.
And so you've got apps like Plume, where Plume, where you can literally just download this app. You have a telehealth visit that costs $100, and then they ship you the cross-sex hormones to your door.
Wow. And there's
no Wild
medical
West.
No medical evaluation. This is what I'm trying to understand is like, isn't there supposed to be a time limit of something like, as far as, mental?
Yes, there used to be. There was safeguarding. You had to live as the opposite sex for a year, but this is when it was still seen as a mental health diagnosis. What the activists argued is that is too stigmatizing. We need easier access to this. We shouldn't have to go through all these hoops in order to get our life-saving medication. And so you've got doctors out in California who literally said on film, well, we wouldn't have a diabetic go through counseling. Well, there's an actual physical test that you can give a child to see if they're a diabetic.
Right.
There
Right.
is no test that you can give a child to see, would this child persist in their dysphoria or will they resolve it? When we know statistically, they most likely will. And then, we didn't even really touch on the explosion of just how many kids we're talking about now.
Right.
We're
That's
not
not how
talking
many
about a
now.
small.
There's a lot.
Well, and it depends on who's doing the survey. I mean, I've seen everything from 1 in 5 to 20 to 30% identify as some sort of LGBTQ in a high school. So, I mean, we're talking very large numbers. And the last thing that I will say is the US has become an outlier with how they treat children experiencing sex confusion. The UK, France, and Sweden, which are all more socially liberal countries,
Right.
have stopped treating children in a medical transition capacity, and they are all recommending psychotherapy as the first line of defense.
Good.
Because they are seeing the harm that's happened.
Right.
They are seeing through an actual proper analysis of the research that, number one, it was very low quality. No control studies are ever used in these types of studies. And number two, we don't have all that much research on these treatments. So the risk far outweigh the benefits when it comes to the medicalization of children.
So what kind of safeguards as a parent that are going through this, what would you suggest from here? You had said you had some resources.
Yes.
Also too, if they want to reach out to you, how they can reach you.
So I have become a senior fellow at Do No Harm. And so that's donoharmmedicine.org. They can reach me through there. Do No Harm is really focused on the medical side of it, but I have become a parent advocate there. A website that is particularly very helpful to parents of children that are struggling is GenSpect, GenSpect.
Okay.
Segem.org, segm.org is a great website to get medically accurate information and research studies.
Okay.
And then the other two that I recommend, Advocates Protecting Children and Partners for Ethical Care. And then there's one podcast that I highly recommend. It's called Gender, the Wider Lens.
Gender,
and that is and that is by Sasha Ayad and Stella O'Malley, two incredible psychotherapists that specialize in gender dysphoria.
Okay.
A Christian resource is the Person and Identity Project.
Okay.
That
I just missed one.
tools.
I'm sorry. After Advocates for Protecting Children, what was the other one? Partners
for Ethical Care.
For Ethical Care. Okay.
And the Person and Identity Project, that Christian resource, is Catholic based, but it's really great for all Christians. And they have a toolkit for parents, for pastors, for schools. It's really a great comprehensive website, how to talk to your children about this, because it's really important that we be inoculating young children for this.
Right.
And that way, when they hear the lies, because they will be exposed to this at some point, even if you have them in private school, even if you are homeschooling. It is in ads right now. There was a video game recently that just allowed avatars to have double mastectomy scars.
God.
So it is pervasive. And I fear this is going to get much worse before it gets better.
Right. Well, I mean, I appreciate you coming on and speaking out about so many things, because this is going on, like I said, several times in several different schools all over. It's not just one place. And as a parent, to hear your story, advocating for your daughter and your family, and, just changing your everyday that you had everyday life to just go out and do this. I want to thank you for all that you do, and for all those that might be going through something. I'm just glad that there's resources for parents, because the narrative that's being pushed is just so wide for the go ahead instead of the stop and let's look at this better, and dig into the situation. Because as it stands, mental health is a big issue, not just in the United States, but everywhere, and it's not being addressed correctly, as we've heard. So again, I thank you. And if there's anything else you want to add, any other kind of resources, what do you have coming up next?
So I'm really starting to get geared up toward legislation,
Okay.
especially here in Florida. There's many states that are putting forth legislation to protect minors from medical transitioning harm.
Okay.
So I'm encouraged by that. But even though a bill gets pushed forward, it does not mean it'll pass or sign into law.
Yeah.
So we have a long way to go. But I'm optimistic. I think the more that we continue to have these conversations and get the truth out there, that is what's going to turn the tide on this.
Absolutely. And again, I thank you for your time, and I feel like it's been very informative. I will have the episode up next week, and please share. I just been wanting to really talk to you because, like I said, this is a pressing issue, and I think you've pioneered, basically, even with your background that you have in, they need to hear that this is not something that it doesn't just happen to one type of family, or it's not going on. Even with you having your clinical background, you were still facing something you weren't totally understanding. And then when it hit home, it was just like a bomb.
Right.
So I thank you again for taking the time, and just keep on fighting the good fight. Thank you so much.
I will. Thank you,
Have
Dawn.
a great
God bless
day.
you.
Thank you. God bless to you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.